Man's Search for Meaning Book Summary. Viktor Frankl's Argument, Lessons, and Lasting Power. The brutal truth about surviving when everything is taken from you. Man's Search for Meaning is a work of memoir, psychology and existential philosophy by Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist Viktor E. Frankl. The original German account appeared in 1946 under the title Ein Psycholog erlebt das Konzentrationslager, commonly translated as A Psychologist Experiences the Concentration Camp. Frankl reportedly dictated it in 9 days after returning to Vienna. Its first American edition appeared in 1959 under the title From Death Camp to Existentialism before later editions adopted the title by which it became internationally known. Modern editions generally contain 2 central parts. The first examines the psychology of prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. The second introduces logotherapy, Frankl's meaning-centered approach to psychotherapy. Some editions also include an afterword on what Frankl calls tragic optimism, affirming life without denying pain, guilt, or death. Beacon Press describes the book as both an autobiographical account and a practical demonstration of logotherapy under extreme conditions. The book has traveled far beyond its original psychiatric audience. Beacon Press reports sales of more than 16 million copies in 50 languages, while the Viktor Frankl Institute identifies it as one of the works named in a Library of Congress reader survey of highly influential books in America. Its popularity can make the book look simpler than it is. It is neither a complete history of the Holocaust, nor a conventional autobiography. Frankl selects episodes according to a psychological purpose, to examine what happens internally when human beings are stripped of ordinary structures, and to ask whether meaningful action remains possible inside radical constraint. The big idea of the book. Frankl's central claim is that the desire for meaning is one of humanity's primary motivational forces. Freud placed great emphasis on pleasure and the management of instinct. Alfred Adler focused more heavily on superiority, striving, and power. Frankl does not deny that pleasure and power influence behavior, but he considers both insufficient as complete explanations of human life. People will surrender pleasure, tolerate pain, and reject power when they believe that a person, task, principle, or responsibility matters more. Meaning in Frankl's framework is not a universal slogan waiting to be copied. It is specific to a person and a situation. The relevant question is therefore not simply, what is the meaning of life? As though one sentence could answer for everyone. The question is closer to, what does this moment require from me? That reversal matters. It transforms the individual from a customer demanding that life provide satisfaction into a responsible participant being asked to act. Frankl argues that meaning can generally be encountered through 3 routes: creating or accomplishing something, experiencing something or loving someone, and adopting a worthy attitude towards unavoidable suffering. The third route attracts the most attention because of the camp memoir. But Frankl does not claim that suffering should be sought. When pain can be removed, the meaningful response may be to remove it. Attitude becomes the central task only where the situation cannot presently be changed. The book's most famous idea, inner freedom, must also be handled precisely. Frankl does not claim that prisoners possessed ordinary political, physical, or economic freedom. Their choices were violently restricted by a system designed to exploit, dehumanize, and murder them. His narrower claim is that external power does not always control the total moral meaning of a person's response. This remaining freedom may be extremely small. It may amount to sharing food, comforting another prisoner, refusing unnecessary cruelty, remembering a loved one, or choosing not to cooperate with the degradation of someone weaker. Small does not mean insignificant. The argument, in one flow, meaning before the camps. A common misunderstanding is that Frankl invented logotherapy in Auschwitz. He did not. His concern with meaning developed years before his deportation. As a young man in Vienna, he studied medicine, corresponded with Sigmund Freud, participated in Alfred Adler's circle, and began developing a meaning-centered approach to psychotherapy. The Viktor Frankl Institute records that he used the term logotherapy publicly by 1926 and continued refining its philosophical foundations during the 1930s. Before the Nazi occupation destroyed Jewish professional life in Austria, Frankl worked with suicidal young people and psychiatric patients. He later became director of the neurological department at Vienna's Rothschild Hospital, which served Jewish patients under Nazi rule. According to the Viktor Frankl Institute, he sometimes falsified diagnoses to prevent mentally ill patients from being transferred into the Nazi euthanasia program. He had also begun writing The Doctor and the Soul, a systematic account of his emerging psychotherapy. This manuscript would become one of the emotional anchors of his imprisonment. Frankl therefore entered the camps not only as a victim and prisoner, but as a doctor carrying an unfinished intellectual task. The camps did not create his theory from nothing. They subjected it to circumstances more brutal than any controlled experiment could ethically reproduce. This distinction protects the book from a misleading myth. Frankl was not a passive sufferer who spontaneously discovered optimism. He was a trained psychiatrist whose existing framework influenced what he noticed, remembered, and later selected for publication. That framework gave him a language for interpreting events. It may also have shaped the limits of his account. Deportation to Theresienstadt. In September 1942, Frankl, his wife Tilly, and his parents were deported from Vienna to the Theresienstadt ghetto. His father died there from exhaustion and illness. Frankl participated in psychological support for distressed new arrivals and suicide prevention efforts within the ghetto. Theresienstadt was simultaneously a prison, transit ghetto, and instrument of Nazi propaganda. More than 140,000 Jews were imprisoned there, and more than 3/4 died either inside the ghetto or after deportation elsewhere. The Nazis presented it deceptively as a comparatively humane settlement, while overcrowding, forced labor, hunger, disease, and deportation defined its real operation. The historical context matters, because man's search for meaning is deliberately selective. Frankl does not provide a comprehensive institutional history of each location. He moves between episodes to illustrate psychological states. In 1944, Frankl, Tilly, and his mother were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. His mother was murdered there. Tilly was later transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she died. Frankl was transferred after a short period to Kaufering, and then Turkheim, both within the Dachau camp system. First phase: shock. Frankl divides prisoners' psychological adjustment into 3 broad phases: shock after admission, apathy during established camp life, and the complicated psychological period following liberation. The first phase begins with transport. Prisoners arrive carrying fragments of their former identities, clothes, professions, family relationships, possessions, and hopes that some misunderstanding might still be corrected. Many know that the situation is dangerous, yet the mind resists understanding the full scale of what is happening. Frankl describes a condition sometimes called the delusion of reprieve. The condemned person imagines, until very late, that a last-minute exception may be made. Perhaps the transport will lead only to work. Perhaps a useful qualification will secure protection. Perhaps a family will remain together. At Auschwitz, such hopes collided with selection. New arrivals were divided, according to whether SS personnel considered them temporarily capable of forced labor. Those judged unfit were commonly sent directly to be murdered. Auschwitz functioned both as a concentration camp complex and as the largest Nazi killing center. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates that approximately 1 million Jews were murdered there. Frankl is selected for labor. He loses his luggage, clothes, body hair, name, and manuscript. The pages hidden in his coat disappear with the coat itself. His previous identity as a physician and author cannot compel the camp to recognize him. This destruction is administrative as well as physical. A prisoner becomes a number, labor resource, and object of command. Privacy vanishes. Decisions about food, sleep, movement, work, bodily exposure, and survival are transferred to others. The manuscript's loss carries more than professional disappointment. It represents the apparent destruction of a future. Frankl had believed the work contained something he still owed the world. Once it disappears, the question becomes whether the task has also disappeared. His answer is no. He begins imagining its reconstruction. Later, while ill with typhus in Turkheim, he reportedly kept himself awake by recreating notes for the doctor and the soul on scraps of paper. The unfinished work becomes a reason to imagine a future self capable of completing it. This is one of the book's most important mechanisms. Meaning operates through orientation towards something not yet completed. The future creates a claim on present behavior, the collapse of ordinary expectations. The shock phase also contains a disturbing process of adaptation. Prisoners discover that conditions they previously believed physically or psychologically impossible can become routine. They sleep in overcrowded spaces, live with filth, endure inadequate clothing, perform exhausting labor, and survive on insufficient food. Frankl is astonished by the body's capacity to continue. Ordinary standards disappear quickly because the camp leaves no energy for preserving them. Yet adaptation does not mean that conditions become harmless. Nazi forced labor systems treated prisoners as expendable. Labor assignments, food access, disease, beatings, selections, and arbitrary decisions could determine whether someone lived another day. At Auschwitz, the type of work assignment alone could make the difference between temporary survival and death. Frankl uses grim humor as evidence of mental adjustment. Prisoners joke about the gap between former anxieties and present reality. Things once regarded as unbearable now seem trivial. Humor does not erase terror. It creates momentary distance from it. That distance becomes a recurring logotherapeutic principle. A person who can observe fear, appetite, or humiliation is not entirely identical to that experience. The ability to step back internally, what Frankl later develops as self-detachment, can create a narrow space between stimulus and response. The space is not magical. It does not stop a guard's blow or restore stolen food. It may, however, prevent the entire self from being absorbed by the blow. Second phase, apathy. After the shock becomes familiar, many prisoners enter the second phase, apathy. Apathy serves as psychological armor. Emotional responsiveness is dulled because full sensitivity would make continuous exposure to suffering intolerable. Scenes that would once have produced horror become part of the visual environment. The prisoner learns not to react openly. Frankl distinguishes this defensive numbness from simple indifference. The camp attacks emotional life until reduced sensitivity becomes useful for immediate survival. Attention contracts around food, warmth, fatigue, work assignments, and threats. This narrowing is one of the camp's victories. A human world of art, vocation, relationships, and moral aspiration is compressed into the next ration and the next command. Food dominates conversation and fantasy. Prisoners exchange recipes, remember meals, and analyze tiny differences in portions. Hunger is not used as an inspirational metaphor. It alters perception, attention, and behavior. The same applies to cigarettes. Ordinary prisoners rarely possess them, while guards, foremen, or privileged prisoners may smoke. The sight of a prisoner smoking can signal unusual status, or, in some cases, that he has stopped preserving resources for the future. Frankl observes jealousy over apparently minor advantages: indoor work, access to a kitchen, a sympathetic foreman, or a place nearer the middle of a marching column. Under normal conditions, such differences might look insignificant. Under conditions of lethal deprivation, they acquire enormous value. This is an important correction to sentimental readings of the book. Meaning does not make the body irrelevant. Hunger still matters. Shelter still matters. Luck, health, labor allocation, and access to small privileges still matter. Frankl's spiritual argument takes place inside material catastrophe, not outside it. Pain and humiliation. Physical pain is only one part of the camp's assault. Frankl often treats humiliation as psychologically distinct from injury. A blow communicates not merely force, but contempt. It tells the prisoner that he is beneath consideration. The insult may be remembered more sharply than the pain. This observation leads into the book's moral center. The camp seeks to impose an identity, disposable, degraded, anonymous, and powerless. A prisoner cannot simply declare the external situation unreal, but he may resist allowing the imposed identity to become the whole truth about himself. For Frankl, dignity is not a feeling of confidence. It is the conduct through which a person refuses complete moral surrender. That conduct may be almost invisible. It can involve refusing to mock another prisoner, performing medical duties with care, offering a piece of bread, or accepting suffering without transferring it to someone weaker. Nothing in this guarantees survival. Some of the most morally admirable prisoners died. Frankl explicitly warns against treating survivors as necessarily superior. Survival could depend on chance, selection, and compromises that cannot be judged comfortably from outside. He remarks that many of the best people did not return. This is where his argument becomes more severe than ordinary resilience culture. Character is not proved by victory. A person may act courageously and still be killed. Meaning concerns the quality of the response, not control over the result. The inner life intensifies. As external life contracts, Frankl observes that some prisoners develop an intensified inner life. Memory becomes a form of refuge. A landscape, poem, prayer, piece of music, or remembered conversation can temporarily restore a world larger than the camp. Sensitive prisoners may suffer acutely, but their inner resources can prevent complete absorption into the immediate environment. Frankl's reflections on his wife form the most famous example. During exhausting labor, he imagines her presence and speaks to her internally. He does not know whether she is alive. The factual answer becomes secondary to the experience of love itself. Love, in his argument, is not possession. It is a mode of perceiving another person in their deepest possibility. Physical separation does not automatically abolish the relationship's meaning. This is not a claim that imagination replaces the living person. Frankl's later discovery of Tilly's death caused profound grief. Rather, he argues that love can remain a real source of orientation, even when access to the beloved has been removed. Beauty performs a similar function. Prisoners notice sunsets, distant mountains, or light passing through trees. Such moments do not make the camp beautiful. They reveal that the camp has not acquired complete ownership over perception. The distinction is crucial. Romanticizing suffering turns horror into scenery for personal development. Frankl's stronger point is that the capacity to recognize beauty can survive in a place organized around ugliness and death. Art also reappears in primitive forms. Prisoners improvise songs, poems, performances, and jokes. These activities do not solve hunger, but they briefly re-establish human beings as creators rather than objects. The camp reduces people to forced labor. Creative attention refuses the reduction. Humor as a weapon of distance. Frankl treats humor as one of the mind's weapons for self-preservation. Humor permits the prisoner to look at a situation from above, even if only for seconds. Frankl and another prisoner imagine future scenes in which camp habits intrude absurdly into ordinary life. The joke creates a vantage point beyond the present. This is psychologically different from denial. Denial insists that danger is not real. Humor recognizes the danger, but changes the relationship to it. The same mechanism later appears in paradoxical intention, one of logotherapy's best-known techniques. A person trapped by anticipatory anxiety may be invited to exaggerate or wish briefly for the very symptom feared. By doing so, the person steps outside the fear's command and interrupts the cycle in which anxiety produces the symptom that then intensifies anxiety. The technique is not suitable for every problem, and man's search for meaning offers only a compressed introduction. Its value lies in the insight that excessive monitoring can strengthen what a person desperately wants to prevent. The harder someone commands themselves not to blush, shake, sweat, stammer, or remain awake, the more attention feeds the reaction. Self-detachment loosens the loop. Religion, solitude, and mental escape. Religious life persists in the camps, despite exhaustion and danger. Prisoners pray, perform rituals where possible, and search for spiritual interpretation. For some, faith offers continuity with a moral order that the camp cannot legitimately overturn. Frankl's logotherapy remains open to religious meaning without requiring the therapist to prescribe a particular theology. The therapist's role is not to dictate the content of the patient's purpose, but to help the patient recognize responsibility, value, and possibility. Solitude also becomes valuable, although genuine privacy is rare. A prisoner may seek a few moments alone with thoughts, memories, or nature. This need for interior space challenges the assumption that survival is purely social or purely individual. Frankl's examples show both. Relationships protect people from isolation, while solitude can protect the self from relentless collective pressure. The practical lesson is not that withdrawal is always healthy. It is that psychological survival may require some territory, internal or external, that the surrounding system does not occupy. Moral choice inside a corrupted system. Frankl rejects simple categories in which every prisoner is virtuous and every person associated with the camp administration behaves identically. The Nazi system was criminal, genocidal, and structurally designed around domination and murder. Within that system, however, individuals still made decisions. Some prisoners became brutal functionaries. Some guards occasionally acted with restraint. Some ordinary prisoners sacrificed for others, while others exploited whoever was weaker. Frankl therefore divides humanity morally rather than nationally. Those who preserve decency and those who abandon it can be found across groups. This does not distribute institutional guilt equally. A prisoner functionary operating under coercion and an SS officer serving the exterminatory system did not possess the same power or responsibility. Frankl's point concerns the persistence of individual agency within unequal structures. Systems shape behavior, reward cruelty, and punish resistance, but they do not transform every participant into an identical machine. That insight is uncomfortable because it denies two convenient beliefs. The first is that good people will automatically behave well regardless of incentives. The second is that individuals carry no responsibility once a system becomes corrupt. Frankl accepts neither. Circumstances matter enormously. Choice still matters within them. The remaining freedom. The philosophical climax of the memoir is Frankl's claim that something remains after almost everything else has been taken. This remaining freedom is often paraphrased too broadly. It does not mean that attitude is unlimited, or that psychological trauma can be defeated by deciding to think positively. Frankl is describing an ethical possibility, not a permanent emotional state. A prisoner may be frightened, apathetic, angry, or despairing, and still face occasional decisions about how to act. The freedom may appear in a single moment, rather than as a stable personality trait. Frankl recalls prisoners who walked through huts comforting others and giving away their remaining bread. Such people were few, but their existence matters to his argument. They demonstrate that total coercion does not always produce total moral determination. The action cannot be explained by self-interest. Giving food away under starvation may reduce one's own chances. It makes sense only in relation to a value considered higher than immediate preservation. That is why meaning cannot be reduced to a survival strategy. Sometimes meaning assists survival. Sometimes it demands sacrifice. The future as psychological structure. Frankl repeatedly connects psychological collapse with the loss of a believable future. A prisoner who cannot imagine any task, person, or responsibility beyond the camp becomes vulnerable to inner surrender. Once the future disappears, the present expands until suffering appears limitless. Frankl recounts the case of a prisoner who dreams that liberation will occur on a particular date. As the date approaches without evidence of release, his condition deteriorates, and he dies soon afterwards. The story is powerful, but should not be read as proof that disappointed hope directly caused death. Disease, starvation, and physical exhaustion were everywhere. The episode illustrates Frankl's clinical perception that expectations can influence resilience, not that attitude overrides biology. His broader concept is future orientation. A person does not need a precise prediction. A task, relationship, or obligation can create direction even when the timetable is unknown. Frankl imagines lecturing after the war about the psychology of the camp. By mentally observing his experience from a future lecture hall, he creates distance from the immediate suffering. This maneuver turns the present into material within a larger story. Once again, it does not make the suffering good. It prevents suffering from becoming the entire horizon of existence. Life as a question. Frankl eventually reverses the traditional question about life's meaning. The prisoner should not demand an abstract explanation from life. He must recognize that life is questioning him through the concrete situation. The answer must be given through action. For one person, the answer may involve surviving for a child. For another, completing unfinished research. For another, helping fellow prisoners through the next night. There is no interchangeable formula. This situational quality separates meaning from mood. A meaningful task may be exhausting, painful, or frightening. Pleasure may arrive as a consequence. But pleasure is not the test. Happiness pursued directly often escapes because attention is fixed on the self's internal state. Frankl makes a similar argument about success. Success is more likely to emerge as the unintended result of dedication to work or service than as the direct product of constant self-measurement. Meaning, therefore, turns attention outward. The person asks less often, "How fulfilled do I feel?" and more often, "What needs doing and what deserves my commitment?" Suffering and responsibility. The most controversial part of Frankl's thesis concerns suffering. He argues that unavoidable suffering can acquire meaning through the attitude adopted towards it. It can become the setting for courage, patience, sacrifice, or moral clarity. This does not imply that suffering is automatically meaningful. Pain can remain chaotic, destructive, and unwanted. Nor does it excuse the person who caused it. Meaning belongs to the sufferer's response, not to the perpetrator's action. The distinction is vital. Without it, Frankl's argument can become a tool for silencing victims. Stop complaining, accept the situation, and turn it into growth. That is not a defensible application. When injustice can be challenged, meaningful action may involve resistance, escape, documentation, treatment, legal action, collective organization, or refusal. Changing oneself is not a substitute for changing a situation that remains changeable. Frankl's third path to meaning applies specifically to suffering that cannot, at that time, be removed. Even then, no outsider has the right to demand heroism. Frankl as a camp doctor. In the later camps, Frankl works in medical roles, including caring for prisoners suffering from typhus. The work gives him a specific responsibility. His medical identity, which the camp attempted to erase, continues through action. He cannot provide normal medicine. Resources are inadequate. Conditions are catastrophic, and death remains common. Yet even limited care creates a structure around his days. This supports one of the book's least sentimental ideas. Meaning does not require confidence that you will succeed. A doctor can act meaningfully while knowing that a patient may die. A prisoner can offer encouragement without knowing whether either person will survive. Responsibility does not wait for guaranteed results. Frankl also describes speaking to groups of prisoners during periods of despair. He reminds them that the future may still contain people or tasks requiring them. He refuses to offer false assurances about survival. Hope, in this framework, is not prediction. It is continued responsiveness to possibility, the escape decision. At one point, Frankl has an opportunity to participate in an escape plan. He initially prepares to leave, but becomes troubled by the thought of abandoning patients. When he returns to the hut, a sick prisoner looks towards him for reassurance. Frankl decides to remain. The importance of the episode lies less in whether staying was strategically correct than in the internal change produced by the decision. Once he chooses according to responsibility rather than fear, his agitation subsides. The external danger remains. This illustrates how meaning can organize action without controlling consequence. The decision does not guarantee safety. It gives coherence to conduct. A shallow reading might praise self-sacrifice in all circumstances. The stronger interpretation is that Frankl recognizes a responsibility he personally cannot abandon. Another person might have had a different legitimate duty: to escape, survive, find family, or report what had happened. Meaning is concrete, not mechanically imitable. Liberation. Frankl's final psychological phase begins when the camp is liberated. Turkheim was liberated by American forces on April 27, 1945. Frankl then worked briefly as a doctor in a hospital for displaced people before making his way back to Vienna, where he learned the scale of his family's deaths. Liberation does not produce immediate happiness. Former prisoners have imagined freedom so often that reality can feel unreal. The nervous system does not instantly shift from prolonged threat into joy. Some experience depersonalization, as though the world lacks substance. Pleasure must be relearned. This is one of the book's most psychologically mature sections. The end of external captivity does not automatically end the internal consequences of captivity. Frankl then identifies two moral dangers after release: bitterness and disillusionment. Bitterness arises when survivors encounter people who appear unable or unwilling to understand what happened. The liberated prisoner may feel that suffering creates a right to unlimited anger. Disillusionment appears when the future object that sustained a person no longer exists. A home has disappeared. A loved one has died. The imagined reward for endurance never arrives. Frankl himself confronts this devastation. His wife, parents, and brother are dead. The future he pictured in the camps cannot simply be resumed. Meaning must therefore survive even the collapse of a particular hope. This may be the book's most important biographical test. It would have been easier to argue that purpose sustains people until they receive what they waited for. Frankl instead returns to a city in ruins and discovers that many of the people for whom he hoped to live are gone. He chooses to reconstruct his work. That decision does not cancel grief. It gives grief a direction. From camp experience to logotherapy. The second major part of the book moves from remembered experience to psychological theory. Logotherapy derives its name from logos, used by Frankl in the sense of meaning. The Viktor Frankl Institute defines it through three connected ideas: freedom of will, will to meaning, and meaning in life. Viktor Frankl Institute. Freedom of will does not mean freedom from every condition. Biological illness, social circumstances, trauma, and external power impose genuine limits. Frankl means that human beings may sometimes take a position towards those conditions, rather than merely expressing them. The will to meaning is the drive to discover and fulfill a purpose. Frankl considers this more fundamental than the pursuit of equilibrium or pleasure. Meaning in life refers to the possibility that each situation contains potential significance that must be recognized and answered by the individual. The therapist does not manufacture a purpose and hand it to the patient, nor should the therapist impose personal values. The therapist helps widen the patient's field of attention so that possibilities previously obscured by fear, self-absorption, or hopelessness become visible. Existential frustration. When the will to meaning is blocked, Frankl describes existential frustration. This is not automatically a mental disorder. A person questioning career, responsibility, mortality, or the value of a life direction may be experiencing a genuinely human conflict rather than pathology. Modern culture often treats discomfort as evidence that something has malfunctioned. Frankl argues that some tension is appropriate. A person who recognizes a gap between present conduct and a meaningful obligation should not necessarily aim to eliminate the tension. The gap may be instructive. Logotherapy calls this productive tension new dynamics, the pull between who a person currently is and the meaning waiting to be fulfilled. Mental health, in this view, does not always require perfect internal balance. It may require commitment to something that asks more of the person. This remains a valuable correction to forms of self-help that equate well-being with permanent calm. A life without tension may be peaceful because it is aligned. It may also be empty because nothing important is being attempted. Neurogenic neurosis. Frankl uses the term neurogenic neurosis for distress arising primarily from conflicts of meaning and value, rather than from conventional psychological drives. The category is controversial because existential, social, biological, and psychological causes rarely separate neatly. A person can experience depression, economic insecurity, grief, trauma, and loss of purpose at the same time. Frankl's useful contribution is not a perfect diagnostic boundary. It is the insistence that questions of purpose cannot always be reduced to symptoms. A worker may not need to become more comfortable in a role that violates deeply held values. A grieving person may not need grief, interpreted solely as dysfunction. Someone confronting mortality may require more than distraction or symptom management. The meaning of the distress can be clinically relevant. That does not make medical or psychological treatment unnecessary. Logotherapy is best understood as one lens within a broader assessment, not as an explanation for every condition. The existential vacuum. Frankl describes the existential vacuum as a widespread experience of emptiness. Traditional instincts no longer tell modern people exactly what to do, while customs and institutions have lost some of their authority. Without inner direction, people may conform to what others do or obey what others demand. The result is not always dramatic despair. It may appear as boredom. Frankl pays particular attention to the emptiness that emerges when work stops and unstructured time begins. A person who has organized identity entirely around routine may discover that there is little underneath it. The vacuum can be filled with pleasure-seeking, aggression, compulsive work, status competition, or passive conformity. These activities provide stimulation without necessarily providing direction. This diagnosis has become more relevant in an environment built around continuous attention capture. A person can spend every free minute consuming information and still avoid deciding what deserves commitment. The problem is not a lack of content. It is the absence of an organizing purpose, meaning through work. The first route to meaning is creative value. What a person contributes through work, action, or creation. Work should not be interpreted narrowly as paid employment. It can include raising children, building a business, writing, repairing, caring, teaching, organizing, designing, or serving a community. The meaningful element is contribution. This does not mean that every job is meaningful or that exploitation becomes acceptable when given inspirational language. Meaning may require changing work, opposing conditions, or refusing a role. Frankl's point is that human beings often experience purpose when attention moves towards a task that exists beyond immediate feeling. The task gives shape to time. It introduces standards. It makes action answerable to something other than impulse, meaning through love and experience. The second route is experiential value, encountering truth, beauty, nature, culture, or another person. Love occupies the highest position in Frankl's account because it allows someone to perceive another human being as more than their present utility. To love someone is to recognize their uniqueness and potential. This is not a defense of obsessive attachment. Love is meaningful because it encounters another person, not because it converts them into property or emotional medication. The distinction matters in practical life. Dependency asks another person to regulate one's identity. Love recognizes their value, while preserving responsibility for one's own conduct. Frankl's memories of Tilly demonstrate that a relationship's meaning cannot be reduced to physical access. Yet the example also contains tragedy. Internal connection does not prevent loss. Love offers meaning, not control. Meaning through attitude. The third root becomes relevant when suffering cannot be changed. A person may still decide what kind of witness, patient, parent, colleague, or human being to become within it. This root is the easiest to misuse because it can sound like moral pressure placed on the suffering person. Frankl's argument should instead be understood as preserving possibility. He is not saying, you must find suffering meaningful. He is saying, suffering does not necessarily remove every possibility of meaningful response. The difference is substantial. The first statement judges the victim. The second refuses to declare the victim's life meaningless. Paradoxical intention. Paradoxical intention uses humor and self-detachment against cycles of anxiety. Someone who fears a symptom becomes hyper-alert for it. Hyper-alertness increases tension. Increased tension makes the symptom more likely, apparently confirming the original fear. The patient is encouraged, in controlled circumstances, to wish for or deliberately exaggerate the feared response. The intervention breaks the struggle for perfect control. The symptom loses some authority once the person can play with it, rather than only flee from it. Frankl presents examples involving phobic and obsessive patterns, insomnia, and performance anxiety. These anecdotes illustrate a technique. They do not establish that it is universally effective. Its broader insight remains strong. Frantic avoidance can become a form of participation in the feared outcome. Dereflection. Dereflection addresses excessive self-observation. Some problems worsen when the person constantly checks whether they are performing, sleeping, enjoying themselves, or feeling fulfilled correctly. Attention collapses inward. Dereflection redirects attention towards another person, a task, or a value. The aim is not to suppress the self, but to reduce the self-monitoring that interferes with natural functioning. This connects psychotherapy to Frankl's larger philosophy of self-transcendence. Human beings often become most fully themselves while attending to something beyond themselves. Meaning is therefore not an endless project of analyzing one's own internal state. It is often discovered in responsible participation. Tragic optimism. Frankl's mature position is not ordinary optimism. Ordinary optimism predicts that events will improve. Tragic optimism affirms that life may retain meaning, despite pain, guilt, and death. The distinction prevents hope from becoming a factual forecast. A person can acknowledge that a situation may end badly, while still acting according to value. The possibility of failure does not automatically make the action pointless. Frankl connects suffering with human achievement, guilt with the possibility of change, and mortality with responsibility. Because time is limited, decisions matter. Because guilt exists, a person may become different. Because suffering occurs, courage and solidarity become possible. None of these transformations is automatic. Tragedy can also destroy, embitter, and traumatize. Tragic optimism names a possibility, not a guarantee. The most important ideas inside the argument. Meaning is specific. Frankl does not provide one universal purpose. Meaning differs between people and across time. The task appropriate to a young parent may not be the task of an elderly patient. A decision that is meaningful in crisis may become unnecessary when circumstances change. This prevents logotherapy from becoming a fixed ideology. The relevant meaning must answer the actual situation. Responsibility comes before fulfillment. Modern self-development often asks what will make the individual feel complete. Frankl starts elsewhere. What are you responsible for? What work, person, or principle has a legitimate claim on you? Fulfillment may follow, but it cannot be commanded directly. The shift from fulfillment to responsibility is the book's most demanding move. Freedom exists in degrees. Frankl does not offer a binary choice between total freedom and total determination. People possess different ranges of action. Wealth, health, law, power, trauma, coercion, and social position affect those ranges. Moral seriousness requires acknowledging both constraint and agency. Ignoring constraint becomes victim blaming. Ignoring agency turns people into objects without responsibility. A future task can stabilize the present. A meaningful future gives present suffering a boundary and direction. The future task need not be grand. It may be making one telephone call, completing one document, protecting one child, or reaching the next medical appointment. What matters is that the present is no longer experienced as an isolated block of pain. It becomes part of a sequence. Meaning is not the same as happiness. A meaningful day can be miserable. A pleasurable day can be empty. Frankl does not oppose happiness. He opposes treating it as a target that can be seized directly. Happiness often emerges from absorption in relationships, contribution, and worthwhile activity. Suffering is not required. The book's reputation can obscure this limit. A person does not need trauma to discover meaning. Frankl's 3 routes include creativity and love precisely because ordinary life already contains opportunities for purpose. Unnecessary suffering should not be glorified. Where change is possible, action may be more responsible than acceptance. The strongest section of the book. The strongest section is Frankl's account of the 3 psychological phases of imprisonment. The structure prevents the memoir from becoming a sequence of disconnected atrocities. Shock, apathy, and post-liberation disillusionment show how the mind adapts over time. The 3rd phase is especially powerful because it denies the fantasy that rescue instantly restores the previous self. Liberation ends imprisonment, but it does not erase bereavement, trauma, or the habits required for survival. Frankl's refusal to end at the camp gate gives the book unusual psychological depth. What the book proves. The book demonstrates that people can remain oriented towards values under extreme constraint. It shows that behavior cannot always be predicted from comfort, appetite, or self-preservation alone. It also provides a compelling framework for understanding why work, love, responsibility, humor, and future orientation can affect the experience of suffering. Frankl's own life strengthens the argument. His ideas about meaning predated imprisonment, survived the destruction of his manuscript, and helped organize his post-war work. He later directed the Vienna Neurological Polyclinic for 25 years and developed logotherapy internationally. The book also demonstrates the therapeutic value of asking questions beyond symptom reduction. A patient may need relief from anxiety or depression. The patient may also need a reason to participate in life once symptoms improve. What the book does not prove. It does not prove that people who find meaning will survive. It does not prove that those who die, collapse, or become traumatized lacked purpose. It does not prove that attitude is more important than food, medicine, safety, or political freedom. It does not prove that every illness is caused by meaninglessness. It does not prove that suffering is necessary for growth. It does not prove that all people possess equal freedom under unequal conditions. Modern meaning-centered therapies, inspired partly by Frankl, have produced promising findings in specific clinical settings. A 2025 systematic review of studies involving women with breast and gynecological cancers reported improvements across outcomes, including meaning, anxiety, depressive symptoms, and quality of life. But the review included only 6 final studies and concerned defined patient groups. Such evidence supports continued research. It does not empirically validate every philosophical claim in logotherapy. What most summaries miss. Most summaries extract the inspirational statements and discard the structure connecting them. Frankl's philosophy depends on a sequence. First, ordinary identity is destroyed. Second, attention contracts around survival. Third, small acts reveal that moral agency has not disappeared completely. Fourth, future tasks and relationships organize endurance. Fifth, liberation exposes the inadequacy of simple optimism. Finally, logotherapy converts these observations into a theory of responsibility. Remove the deprivation, moral ambiguity, and post-liberation grief, and the book becomes generic motivation. Frankl's message is not that positive thinkers win. It is that meaningful action remains valuable even where winning is uncertain or impossible. What most people misunderstand, the most common misunderstanding, is that Frankl tells readers to choose happiness. He does not. He asks them to choose responsibility where choice remains available. Another misunderstanding is that meaning must be invented through willpower. Frankl more often writes as though meaning is discovered in the demands of reality. A person needs care, a task remains unfinished, an injustice requires opposition, or a loss must be carried without allowing it to justify cruelty. Meaning is not whatever story makes someone feel better. A self-serving fantasy may provide comfort while avoiding responsibility. For Frankl, authentic meaning points beyond the isolated self. The dangerous misreading. The dangerous misreading is, suffering is good for you, so changing the situation is unnecessary. Applied carelessly, that idea can protect abusive employers, governments, partners, institutions, or ideologies. It places the burden of transformation on the injured person, while leaving the cause untouched. A responsible application follows a clear order. First, determine whether the suffering can be prevented, treated, challenged, or escaped. Second, take available action. Third, where an unavoidable remainder exists, decide how to carry it without surrendering every value. Meaning must never become an excuse for passivity. Frankl's own life contradicts passive fatalism. Before deportation, he worked, wrote, treated patients, and resisted Nazi medical procedures where he could. Inside the camps, he cared for patients and attempted psychological intervention. After liberation, he rebuilt his work. His philosophy concerns action under limits, not obedience to them. The tailored interpretation. The deepest lesson of man's search for meaning is not that the mind can make any situation pleasant. It is that a hostile situation does not automatically deserve the authority to define your entire identity. Systems often attempt to reduce a person to their immediate status: prisoner, patient, employee, failure, victim, debtor, dismissed worker, or unwanted partner. Those statuses may describe real circumstances. They do not exhaust the person. The strategic question is therefore not, how do I pretend this has not harmed me? It is, what parts of my identity, responsibility, and future remain outside its control? That question produces concrete answers. Evidence can be preserved. Work can be reconstructed. A body can be treated. A skill can be developed. A relationship can be judged by behavior rather than fantasy. A legal right can be enforced. A person can refuse to convert betrayal into lifelong dependency on the betrayer. Frankl's philosophy is strongest when translated into disciplined resistance. Do not deny the damage. Do not hand the damage unlimited jurisdiction over what happens next. Why this book still matters. Modern life offers stimulation on a scale Frankl could not have witnessed. But stimulation does not solve meaninglessness. Digital systems are designed to occupy attention, compare status, and produce repeated emotional reactions. Workplaces can measure output while leaving people uncertain why the output matters. Consumer culture can satisfy preferences without creating responsibility. The existential vacuum can therefore coexist with constant activity. A person may be busy from morning to night and still feel that nothing is moving towards a worthwhile end. Frankl provides a diagnostic question. What responsibility would remain meaningful, even if applause pleasure, and immediate success were removed. The answer identifies a deeper motivational structure. His work also matters in medicine and psychotherapy. Contemporary meaning-centered psychotherapy, particularly in serious illness and palliative care, draws on Frankl's emphasis on purpose, legacy, relationships, attitude, and responsibility. Research reviews describe meaning-centered interventions as potentially useful for reducing existential distress and improving well-being in defined clinical populations. The book also remains relevant politically. Authoritarian systems do not merely restrict action. They attempt to define reality, isolate people, and make resistance appear pointless. Frankl's account shows why preserving truthful memory, solidarity, and moral choice matters even before victory is visible. That does not mean private resilience can replace collective action. It means collective action depends on individuals who have not allowed fear or conformity to become their total identity. If you only remember 3 ideas, you may not control the situation, but you must identify the choice that remains. The remaining choice may be limited, costly, or emotionally unsatisfying. It still matters, because it determines your participation in what happens next. Meaning is found through responsibility, not endless self-observation. A worthwhile task, person, or principle can organize behavior more effectively than constantly asking whether you feel motivated, happy, or healed. Never romanticize avoidable suffering. Change what can be changed. Challenge what should be challenged. Use attitude as a response to the unavoidable remainder, not as an excuse for tolerating preventable harm. The sentence explains the book. A human being cannot control every condition of life, but can still be responsible for the meaning expressed through the next available action. The real-life test. The practical test of Frankl's philosophy begins when circumstances are genuinely unpleasant. Suppose a person loses a job unfairly. A shallow motivational response would insist that everything happens for a reason. Frankl's framework requires more precision. The person should acknowledge the financial, psychological, and reputational damage. They should preserve evidence, calculate what is owed, obtain advice, enforce rights where appropriate, and search for new work. At the same time, they should identify what the employer no longer controls: professional knowledge, documented achievements, future applications, personal conduct, and the decision not to build an identity around the employer's approval. Meaning appears in the combination of reality and responsibility. The same test applies to illness. Meaning does not require pretending that pain is beneficial. The patient seeks treatment, practical support, and relief. Where limitations remain, the patient decides what relationships, contributions, or attitudes are still possible. In relationships, meaning does not require enduring disrespect. A person can love someone while refusing dependency, manipulation, or repeated betrayal. Responsibility may require leaving rather than suffering nobly. In leadership, meaning means serving a task beyond status. A leader driven only by recognition becomes unstable when praise disappears. A leader organized around responsibility can continue making necessary decisions while unpopular. In grief, meaning does not mean replacing the person who died or explaining why the death had to happen. It can mean preserving what the relationship made possible: values, memories, responsibilities, and actions that continue because the person lived. Frankl's real-life standard is therefore strict. Do not ask whether a belief makes pain disappear. Ask whether it produces truthful, responsible, and proportionate action. 5 questions to test whether you understood the book. What is the difference between accepting unavoidable suffering and passively tolerating preventable suffering? Why does Frankl consider responsibility more fundamental than the direct pursuit of happiness? How can external freedom be destroyed while a limited form of moral freedom remains? Which parts of Frankl's survival account are philosophical interpretation, and which factors lay outside personal attitude? What specific person, task, or principle currently asks something responsible of you? The final lesson. Man's search for meaning does not offer a method for becoming invulnerable. Viktor Frankl was harmed, bereaved, starved, imprisoned, and permanently separated from the life he had expected. Meaning did not protect his family, preserve his manuscript, or make the camps less criminal. What it offered was orientation. It gave him reasons to treat patients, reconstruct his work, remember his wife, observe human behavior, and imagine obligations beyond the camp. That is the book's enduring force. Meaning is not a reward granted after suffering has been explained. It is the structure created when a person recognizes that, despite damage and constraint, something still deserves a response. The response may not defeat the situation immediately. It prevents the situation from becoming the final author of the person.